Okay, well, my name's Sabrina Alam. I've been in the space industry for a while. My background is actually something not very sustainability related, but in theoretical physics, which has been a great journey. Then went to ISU, so the International Space University, then went to NASA, and then went to ESA in Cologne, and then made my way into SES. And here I've been really fortunate to be able to lead aspects of our ESG and sustainability program. And now I head up space sustainability and program manage our ESG department alongside an incredible team. So I want to talk to you a little bit today about, well, firstly, what does sustainability mean? What does ESG mean? I think some of you may have heard it, some of you may have not. And then I want to give you an opportunity to ask me any questions. So really happy to do so. So let's jump into it. I hope everyone recognizes this, and if not, I will go into it. So these are the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals. They were created for the world to achieve by 2030. And the reason why I've put them here is because when we talk about sustainability and sustainable development, we refer to this. And reason being is when the UN came up with this, they wanted a nice way for the whole world, companies, individuals, and so on, to look at sustainability in a way that is structured, in a way that we are able to have targets and metrics, and we can actually take forward. So as mentioned, there are 17 of them. And one of the things I just want to point out is that a lot of the time we get a bit mixed up and say, I'm only tackling number 1 or 2 or 3. But actually, when you tackle one, you usually tackle many of the others. And the point here is that you can categorize them, and it provides a framework for the way corporations look at sustainability. And that's what we call ESG. So firstly, what is sustainable development? So sustainable development, and the actual definition of it, is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So unfortunately, I would say that we don't live sustainably at the moment, and we are depleting the world of resources, and there is huge inequality. And all of that leads to our future generations not meeting their own needs. And some of you may be thinking, okay, well, how does this relate to space? And I'm going to get there. So when we look at sustainable development, we look at something called the 5P model. And the 5P model is based on people, prosperity, peace, partnership, and planning. And you can see there that these different P's are attributed to different SDGs. So firstly, what is ESG? So ESG is actually a framework that every organization can use and to understand the environmental impact, the social impact, and actually understand what governance is. And it's a measure of an organization's sustainability efforts with the aim to target those UN SDGs that I showed you earlier. It's also very important to investors, to customers, and so on, and your different stakeholders and your employees, for example, when you talk about sustainability. They want to know what you're doing from an ESG perspective. How are you contributing to the benefit of the environment, to the benefit of humankind? How are you benefiting governance? And some may say, well, what is governance? So I'll go into that in a moment. But I want to show you this model here. So when we talk about ESG, we mention environmental, social, and governance. And the environmental there is really the reduction of the environmental impact. And you can see we, again, attribute those UN SDGs to the E. The social side, stakeholder engagement, education, development planning for urban cities, and so on. And the governance is how we increase global transparency, how we strengthen reporting, for example, and how we actually, as a corporation or as a world, as a society, we tell people the good that we're doing and how we improve on that. Unfortunately, there's not great transparency with organizations at the moment. And so one of the key, efforts that Europe are focusing on are how do we use reporting standards and regulations to improve what this governance is, essentially. So for the space industry, ESG could mean these different things. So for the E, we look at GHG emission reduction, biodiversity loss, waste and pollution, space sustainability. So space sustainability is its whole other environment but we still consider that in our environmental aspect. Life cycle assessment. So what does LCA actually mean? LCAs are looking at our products and our services all the way from the raw material phase to the manufacturing, to transportation, to usage, and all the way to the end of life. So it's really understanding your impact on the world across the whole value chain of your products and your services. And that goes to the last point, which is value chain management. So when we talk about value chain, as I mentioned, for a space company that and a satellite operator like SES, we talk about how our satellites are being built. Who are the suppliers? Who are, who supply our suppliers with raw materials and so on? And then how is it getting to SES? What transportation methods are used? Then from there, how do we send it off to our vendors, such as our launchers, our third-party teleports, for example? And then once it's in space, what do we do with it? So, that value chain management is important, because if you're looking at ESG, then actually you need to make sure that you're speaking to your value chain about this, because ESG is not a journey that you can do alone. It's actually something that needs to be linked with business objectives as well. And when we look at the social, sometimes we forget that this is really part of sustainability, but diversity, inclusion at all levels. This is key. And when we say D&I, we don't just mean having a room full of different types of people. It's how do you incorporate different programs and initiatives to make people feel comfortable within an organization. And that's where inclusion comes in. So when we talk about companies hiring people, what are you doing to ensure you're retaining those people? Employee well-being. So employee well-being is a huge part to the S. Workers' rights, community engagement and empowerment. Every one of us and every organization has to rely on communities, on governments where they operate, and so on. So it's about making sure that we engage with them. We know who that we are working with. We know who we're impacting, and we're doing everything we can to empower them. Then you've got humanitarian efforts. So this could be whatever your business is, whatever your products or services are. How are you going to impact the world in a better way? How are you going to reduce inequality? And a pure example for SES is providing connectivity through our services, essentially. And then advocacy for best practice. It's all good doing great. It's, all good having the people in your company focusing on this. But if you're not advocating and telling the world what you're doing and why others should be doing it, there won't be much change. You need to influence as well. And that's what we mean by advocacy. Corporate governance. So again, I mentioned transparency. So how are you as an organization being ethical? How are you being transparent? How are you accurately reporting? So for those of you who aren't aware, many organizations, depending on where you're based, have to report to different standards. So you have to tell the governments, your investors, and so on, hey, this is what I'm doing from a financial perspective, but we're taking that one step forward. This is what we're doing from a impacting the world perspective. And that is related to supply chain management. So looking at just your suppliers and your tier 1 suppliers, meaning your direct suppliers, then who do they work with to get those materials, and who do they work with, and so on and so on. A lot of space technology actually contains rare earth minerals, which actually means a lot of our suppliers are probably working with suppliers who do mine, who do have an impact on, say, the environment, but also people and communities. And that's something we have to be really wary of. So how do we manage that and ensure we're doing a good job there? Regulatory and legal intervention. So there are so many different regulations and legal interventions that companies have to get involved in. So corporate governance is also about that. And executive remuneration. So how are your senior leaders, how are the top people in your company being graded across ESG criteria? Is it all based on financial? If so, that's not ESG. Is it based on how well they're doing from a climate standpoint? Is it based on how well they're doing from a diversity and inclusion standpoint? And so that's some of what we mean there. So moving on, why do we even look at ESG? So we call this era the remarkable rise of ESG. And in 2021, we saw a substantial increase in investment where the figures reached over 50 billion. And so when we talk about 2025 and onwards and where we go, the ESG world and ESG investment globally is looking to reach over 50 trillion of investment, and that's in US dollars. So there is a financial backing and financial reason why we look at ESG. And it's been proven that younger generations care a lot more about sustainability. And when they look for a new place of employment, having sustainability and ESG actually is something that's very appealing to them. So why is ESG important to businesses? And this is something called the 5R model. And the first one is resilience. So actually, ESG enables companies to avoid, setting up the poor lending conditions, essentially, meaning when you work with governments, you can earn subsidies, you can strengthen your regulatory agenda as well. That leads to less corruption cases, which means you're in a position to actually do a lot better because you understand your full extent of your business. From a returns perspective, you actually gain money from in terms of financial performance. Your customers want to know what you're doing to help the world be a better place. Your investors do too, your community, the government. And also from our 5R model, risk. Especially with the space industry, there's a huge amount of risk that is carried. And when we talk about risk, we mean investment risk, we mean climate change risk. A lot of our, say, launches and where they're based are near the seas. If global sea levels are rising, how do we ensure that actually our products and our services are going to be safe? And that's part of the risk strategy. So when you look at ESG, you also look at risk. And so strong ESG strategies are negatively correlated with those investment risks as well, because you would have actually done your due diligence, you would have looked at your business and looked at where you can improve. Resources. So if you understand where your negative impact is, or where you're, say, wasting, you can actually minimize your negative externalities and minimize your waste, which actually saves you a lot of money. And then lastly, reinforcement. So well-performing ESG programs increase employee productivity, reduce gender inequality and pay gap, and actually brings in new talent and keeps people there. It makes people want to stay when they know they're being impact-led and where they know they can make a big difference. So what I want to do now is go through what we've done at SES. So I've showed you kind of the backing for sustainability and for ESG, and for the space industry in specific. At the moment, we are very great in terms of exploration and technological developments and Earth observation. But actually, the key message is we need a concrete strategy, a concrete sustainability viewpoint holistically to make sure that actually we're not just saying, oh, we're going to put a satellite up there to look at the Earth, but we're putting a satellite up there. And these are all the impact that we've had on the world by doing so. So at SES, we undertook something called a materiality assessment. And a materiality is quite important when you want to know what should you focus on. ESG issues are so broad. I could ask any of you now, hey, what's the most important thing we should focus on? And I guarantee all of you will come up with something different. And so that's what we did. We spoke to our stakeholders. So stakeholders ranging from our customers to our investors, to our employees, even to our competitors and industry peers and NGOs. And we said, what do you think is the most important thing for us to focus on as a company against importance to society and business impact? So we've got this materiality matrix where we have 3 different tiers. The first one being including cybersecurity and data privacy. As a satellite operator, of course, we sell connectivity. So if we don't have data privacy installed, and if we aren't looking at cybersecurity, of course, that's a huge problem for the business. But also GHG emissions, so carbon emissions, renewable energy, that's a huge one as well. space waste and congestion, so space sustainability essentially. So when we put our satellites in space, we also need to think about how are we able to bring them down? And because we are a MEO and GEO operator, meaning we don't operate in low Earth orbit, we operate above. Most of the time we do put our satellites into graveyard orbit. So how can we extend the life of our satellite? How can we say refuel the satellite? And then what can we do once the satellite's up there to keep it going for longer, or bring it back down to Earth? What technological innovations? And then actually, how do we measure where we are? How do we track and so on? And then you've got your tier 2, which is about responsible use of tech, local community impact that I mentioned earlier, and then your tier 3. So biodiversity and land use, diversity in STEM education, operational waste, for example. So once we did this, we said, okay, now we understand where we are. Now we understand where everyone wants us to be. Let's create a strategy. So we then took what we found, we called them material issues, and we said, we're going to tackle these material issues in something called our Horizon strategy, where sustainable space meets sustainable Earth. So this is about 4 key pillars. Sustainable space, where again, I mentioned, we look at our debris, we look at our impact in the space environment. How can we innovate our technology to reduce our footprint? How can we work with partners, and how can we advocate? The second one being climate action. We want to be net zero by 2050. So we need to reduce our GHG, so greenhouse gas emissions, across our whole value chain. And then how can we enable others to do that? Through connectivity. The third is diversity and inclusion. So you've probably heard a lot about diversity and inclusion before, and why the industry needs diversity and inclusion. For sustainability, it's important because it's been proven that organizations with more diverse people on its board actually take sustainability more seriously and look at the wider picture of their impact. But it's also important because the space industry needs talent from all over the world. They need talent from different genders, from people with different attributes, sexuality, ethnic backgrounds, and so on. So that's what we mean. And then we want to position ourselves to enable and inspire the rest of the industry to do the same. And that fourth one is critical human needs. How can we empower the communities where we operate to thrive with our services? For example, we provide connectivity to schools, to hospitals, to information service providers as well. How do we expand that to make sure that people in remote areas also have this access to, say, education or to healthcare? And all of that is related to the Sustainable Development Goals. And just what I want to touch on here is that in order for us to actually take on a strategy and do this, say, properly, it's very important that you have departmental targets. What are you as a company going to do? Okay, now you've got that. Now, what are your departments going to do? Where can your procurement department make a difference? Where can your human resources department make a difference? Where can your technology departments make a difference? ESG and sustainability isn't something that should sit separately to an organization or should sit separately to business objectives, as I mentioned earlier. It's something that needs to coincide. They need to mold together for it to actually work properly. The point is that when you make decisions, you are understanding the full extent of your impact based on other criteria than just financial or risk. So that's something I just wanted to share with you. And so some of the recommendations for us as an industry to go forward with sustainability in the true way is, firstly, organizations need to put a real budget towards sustainable development. There's no point just putting a load of things on Twitter and saying, yes, we care about sustainability. We need to see the money towards it. There needs to be real programs and initiatives that can actually tackle sustainability at the root of the problem, not just surface level things. And everyone on board, so people in the company, need to understand, what is ESG? Why are we doing it? And where can we align the business to ESG? And how do we achieve those UN Sustainable Development Goals? The second one is industry consolidation. We as an industry have so many, we have so many amazing organizations. We have so many great leaders in this place. So let's bring us together. Let's actually collaborate on issues, from how do we reduce our technological environmental footprint, to actually let's share publicly available resources. Let's train people up together. Let's have working groups. Let's actually discuss these kind of things in a more concrete way. Because again, we hear about sustainability so much, but how do we do this in the best way? And how do we get everyone on board to understand the same version of sustainability? So we need to define ESG. We need to have specific industry experts for sustainability who could actually lead the industry together in a collaborative way. And the reason that's important is because when we look at our products and services, no one organization sits by themselves. You have to work with other organizations in and out of your industry to be able to go forward with your products and your services. So that one's a real key. Also, ESG and funding criteria. There are many funding bodies for the space industry, but most of these don't incorporate sustainability, and they don't actually ask the question, your technology is great, but how are you going to limit your impact on the environment? How are you going to ensure diversity and inclusion within your workforce? So one of the big recommendations here is that if funding bodies actually incorporated ESG into their criteria, you will see startups and big organizations starting to change their ways because they have to think differently. And that forces the next generation of the space industry to really take forward sustainability at the beginning of the organization's life, rather than being established and then thinking, oh gosh, now we need to do this. And then the fourth, international regulations. So a lot of us are unaware, but there are many international regulations. And with upcoming governance directives relating to ESG, it's really important that the space industry has a say, because at the moment, we're not sitting on the table with the experts. We're not sitting in parliament and actually advocating for what the space industry needs to take forward. And so there are many different directives and regulations that we will all have to face. A key one being the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive that the EU Commission has imposed on all of the companies that fall within a scope in Europe, which actually a lot of space companies will be in as well. And they say you now have to report to E, S, and G criteria, and it will be audited and made publicly available. We didn't have a seat at that table. And where we operate a bit differently, because we are so global, because our value chains are so complex, it's important that we get up to speed on what is going on worldwide in terms of sustainability. So those were some of the key messages that I wanted to say, but I'm really happy to speak about this for hours and also answer any questions that people may have. And maybe Martinez, you could read some questions out to me.
Yeah, here you go. So as far as the questions go, so I have here from my side. So obviously phenomenal presentation, and I love the passion, and I love that you're very enthusiastic. And obviously, as your role with SES is obviously to be enthusiastic and to talk about ESG and the importance of it, which I greatly appreciate you today for sharing the importance of it during your presentation. As a question I wanted to ask also, what specific engineering and design considerations must be taken into account when building and operating space systems that prioritize ESG performance, such as reducing carbon emissions, promoting sustainable resource utilization, and ensuring equitable access to space resources?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So thanks, whoever posed it. The key thing is right now, I can't tell you because firstly, different technologies are different depending on which organization. Your value chain is different. So the key thing that we asked to do is conduct a life cycle assessment. It's not easy, and ESA right now are looking at the way that we can standardize how all space companies do life cycle assessments. But what it allows you to do is understand your footprint across climate change, biodiversity loss, eutrophication, for example, so many different indicators. And it will tell you, okay, your design phase is taking up this much energy, so your climate change potential is much greater. If you reduced your energy by this much, actually, you would be much more efficient. Or for example, the amount of rare earth minerals you're using in your product is contributing so greatly to resource depletion. And so if you reduced your amount of rare earth minerals in your products or services by X amount, you could actually be much better. So until companies conduct those and understand what is specific to them and where their products and services are having the most impact, it's very difficult to say this particular piece needs to be done. First, understand your impact, and then from there, you can make informed decisions and say, okay, in my next iteration of my product, I'm going to do a trade-off based on this life cycle assessment and environmental criteria. So that means if you're looking at two different products that you want to put on the market, you say product A financially means this, product B financially means this. Environmentally, actually, product A is much worse for climate change. So I'm going to actually take product B, even though it might cost X amount more. So that's what really needs to be done for us to move forward with, to understand your environmental impact and then make those decisions.
Yes, thank you. That's a very good point. Very great point, actually, for people and everybody who is watching this online, or you're watching this as the recording. So another question that I have here: how can space industry stakeholders leverage emerging technologies in data analytics to monitor and measure ESG performance throughout the space value chain, from upstream design and manufacturing to downstream operations and end-of-life disposal?
Okay, so another very good question. So the first thing is form partnerships with your value chain. A lot of the time we're afraid to speak to our value chain or our vendors or our suppliers because we think it may cost more money to ask them for more criteria. In that procurement process, when you're asking or designing or whatever it might be, ask them, how is your product contributing to environmental factors? You need to be asking those questions. And when they give those results back to you, you can take that forward and make those decisions. And then you do that, not just say for your manufacturers, but you do that for your other vendors as well. Once you start adding ESG criteria into your own procurement process, all of a sudden you will see that it will have a knock-on effect and everyone else will start considering ESG issues as well. Sorry, could you repeat the question? There was a part that I did want to respond to, but I can't remember where we were.
So monitor and measure ESG performance throughout the space value chain, from upstream design and manufacturing to downstream operations and end-of-life disposal.
Yeah, so yeah, to my point, I mean, you know, ask the right questions. If your product's already out there, still ask the questions, of course. I mean, it's really important to know so that next time you know what data people have available and don't. And I can tell you now, the majority of companies don't measure this kind of stuff. And they won't if they don't think there's a financial need, because it is extra work. If you as a customer, if you as in within your value chain are asking your suppliers and your vendors, all of a sudden there are financial implications, and companies now have to start looking at how to measure things a bit differently and give you that data. So that's probably the best way to do it.
And lastly, as we have a minute here left, so just a question from Mikhail, where he asks, can you estimate SES satellite cost dedicated to SCG? So for example, a percentage of your total costs.
Yeah, so I can't exactly, there's also information I can't share, but I can tell you now that we got very good budget, probably more than most departments and just under our technology departments, for us to really go forward with our programs and initiatives. So SES is really taking ESG and sustainability seriously. They put the money towards it, and now we are at a stage where we can really start making an impact. So watch this space. Feel free to follow me on LinkedIn, and I'm happy to have any discussions offline. But just want to say huge thank you for having me here. Enjoyed it, and good luck with all of your sustainability journeys as well.